Good afternoon and welcome, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Youssef Munayyer. I'm head of the Palestine-Israel program and a senior fellow at Arab Center, Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us for this webinar titled The US Israel Visa Waiver Program Agreement, Assessing the Terms and Implications. The US Visa Waiver Program is a program of the US government that permits citizens of participating nations entry into the United States while waiving traditional and often lengthy application and interview processes involved in getting a visa to travel to the US. Approximately 40 countries, mostly European nations, in addition to Australia, New Zealand, Taiwan, Singapore, and South Korea, participate in this program. Israel has long sought entry into this coveted club, but has consistently fallen short of the program's requirements. Most notoriously, the reciprocity standard, which would require Israel to treat all American travelers, including Palestinian Americans, equally. Needless to say, that has not been the case. On July 19th, however, the United States State Department released a statement welcoming what it said was changes in Israeli policy regarding travel for American citizens. It said, quote, "We understand that these changes are designed to ensure equal treatment for all U.S. citizens without regard to national origin, religion, or ethnicity. The updated travel policies will allow U.S. citizens to travel to Israel via all ports of entry," the statement said, including Ben Gurion Airport. The State Department went on to say that it's working closely with the government of Israel to, quote, "further the shared goal that Israel join the visa waiver program when it meets all of the program requirements." News reports also indicated that the United States and Israel signed a memorandum of understanding around these changes during the recent visit of the Israeli president to Washington, D.C. But thus far, it has not released this agreement. New Israeli guidelines published by the Israeli government online, however, continue to show different procedures for different Americans, underscoring that Israeli policies still fall short of equal treatment for U.S. citizens. All of this raises numerous questions. Will the United States accept this unequal treatment of Palestinians as an acceptable form of reciprocity? Why is all of this suddenly happening now? What is the timeline for the agreement and its implementation? What are the implications of this agreement for all involved, and especially for Palestinians traveling to and through Israeli-controlled access points? And how would this impact the United States domestically and its relations with Israel and the Palestinians? We're pleased to have with us this morning an excellent panel to discuss these announcements, new policies, and what the implications of them all are. We will begin with 10 to 12 minutes of remarks from each of our panelists, followed by a moderator's Q&A and then questions from the audience. Please note to all those tuning in, you don't need to wait until the Q&A portion to submit your questions for our speakers. You can send them in at any time using the Q&A feature in Zoom or by email to events@arabcenterdc.org. And so let me briefly introduce our panelists today. Zaha Hassan is a fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Adam Shapiro is Director of Advocacy for Israel and Palestine at Democracy for the Arab World Now, or DAWN. Jessica Montel is Executive Director of Hamoked, the Center for the Defense of the Individual. And Maya Berry is Executive Director of the Arab American Institute. Welcome to all of you, and thank you for being with us today. With that, I'd like to turn it over first to Zaha to give us her introductory remarks.
Thank you, Youssef, and thanks to the Arab Center for inviting me. It's always a pleasure, and I'm also thrilled to be with my colleagues here, whom I have so much respect for. What I'll do first is just give some background and insight on why there seems to be this rush to get Israel into the visa waiver program by September 30th of this year. Then I'll discuss how the trial period called for under the MOU that you mentioned, Yusuf, is supposed to operate. And then finally, I'll conclude by discussing whether the trial period will actually allow for an adequate assessment of Israel's compliance with federal law. So for background, first, I want to remind folks that the US Visa Waiver Program is a highly selective program that exists primarily to protect US national security and the security of American citizens. Countries and their nationals are very keen to enter this program because entry to it allows a foreign national, like you said, Yusuf, to just book a flight and enter the US after providing some travel information through a portal. They can arrive at a US port of entry without first getting a visa at the US embassy or consulate abroad. It saves them money, it saves them time, and it saves them from having to go to this US embassy or consulate and presenting a police certificate and other documentation to prove that they're not intending to overstay their visitor's visa. And again, over 40 countries, or only 40 countries, have this admission into the program, but not a single one has ever had a special memorandum of understanding allowing them to treat American citizens differently based on their race, religion, or national origin. Every one of these countries must respect the rights of all American travelers in the exact same way that the US government treats that country's nationals and citizens. And keep in mind, the US has a constitution that does apply, certain provisions do apply to visitors to our country, including the due process clause. So Israel has wanted to enter the visa waiver program for many years. Two things mainly were standing in the way. One was the fact that too many Israelis have been denied visas to the US in any one fiscal year, which runs from October 1st to September 30th. This is known as the visa rejection rate. Israel has to keep it below 3%, the rejection rate in a fiscal year, or a lower average percentage of the previous 2 years to be admitted. The visa rejection rate gives the US an idea about whether travelers from a foreign country are too high risk for overstaying their tourist visas to forego an interview at the US embassy. The other problem Israel had for admission to the US Visa Waiver Program, as Yusuf mentioned, is this well-documented long history of treating certain US citizens discriminatorily, harassing them at ports of entry, interrogating them, strip searching them, unreasonably delaying their entry or exit from Israel and the occupied territories, or completely banning them from entry. Americans have also been denied entry for their political speech or human rights activism. There is also the issue of discriminatory treatment, even once you're inside Israel or the occupied territories. Today, in fact, there are 2 US citizens in the occupied territories who are subjected to a travel ban and are not allowed to leave the West Bank. One is in his 70s. He has health issues and he's trying to return to the US to get medical treatment. And another is a human rights defender who's been recognized for his work by the UN. Even US members of Congress have been prevented from entering Israel or the occupied territories. Congressman Mark Pocan from Wisconsin and 2 other members of Congress were denied transit to go to Gaza and to go check on a US funded school there. The members of Congress were told by the Israeli officials that they didn't fit the criteria for entry to Gaza, and no criteria was given to them or shared with them despite their repeated requests. Now, the State Department has long warned travelers about Israeli mistreatment of Americans, and it has issued travel advisories on the subject. Literally just a few days before the announcement last week that Israel was entering this trial program, the State Department spokesman and Biden administration officials who were responding to inquiries from members of the US Senate acknowledged that Israel still doesn't qualify for the US Visa Waiver Program because of its treatment of certain classes of American citizens. Now, there are at least 5 reasons why the State Department can't acknowledge that Israel, or, that there's at least 5 reasons why Israel has not qualified for full reciprocity under the Visa Waiver Program. First, in 2022, just last year, the Israeli Military Authority over the West Bank, known as COGAT, published a policy document that basically banned all tourism to the West Bank, but for a few categories of people. Now, exempted from that were travelers going to visit illegal Israeli settlements in the West Bank. They have no restrictions, but pretty much everybody else was going to be banned from entering the West Bank for tourism. Another reason for finding Israel didn't qualify is the fact that Israel prevents Palestinians with a Palestinian ID number from using Israeli airports. Palestinian Americans residing in the occupied territories have to request a special military issued permit to use Ben Gurion Airport, and frequently this request is denied. Third, Israel prevents Americans writ large from entering Gaza for visits because of the blockade it has imposed for 16 years now. And a fourth reason is that Americans of Palestinian descent are treated under martial law when visiting the occupied territories, while Americans visiting Israeli Jews in the West Bank are treated under Israeli civil law. Fifth, and finally, Israeli immigration laws that are still on the books today require border officials to deny entry to any traveler who expresses support or is an activist for Palestinian human rights. Now, because the US government does not put similar restrictions, such as Israelis wishing to enter and transit through the US, Biden administration officials have been unable to certify that Israel meets the reciprocity requirement of the US Visa Waiver Program. So the million-dollar question is, why start a trial program for Israel now when Israel has not changed its law and policy to qualify for the US Visa Waiver Program? From what I can tell, there seems to be a widespread recognition that if Israel isn't admitted into the Visa Waiver Program this fiscal year, it is unlikely to qualify in the future. This is because Israel was primarily able to meet the less than 3% rejection rate for 2022 because of the fact travel out of Israel to the US was low during that period due to COVID restrictions. Israel's normal rejection rate is between 5 and 6%. I believe there is also a growing understanding that as Israel entrenches its one-state reality and as it moves to officially annex the occupied West Bank, Israel's visa rejection rate determination won't be limited to counting the number of Israeli citizens within Israel's pre-1967 borders. The rejection rate will have to include Palestinians in the occupied territories whose lives and travel are completely controlled by Israeli authorities. Now, keep in mind, the Palestinian Authority is not a recognized state by the US, and the US government to this day does not recognize something called Palestinian nationality. So if Israel annexes the West Bank, the US government will have to make a determination on what nationality Palestinians hold for purposes of the Visa Waiver Program. And the only applicable nationality Palestinians can be said to hold once Israel annexes the West Bank will be Israeli nationality, because the only competent authority to issue travel documents at that time will be Israel. So, this is just one of the reasons why certain Israeli officials do not want to see the dissolution of the Palestinian Authority, because for now, the Palestinian Authority is issuing travel documents. September 30th is the end of the current fiscal year. We are only days away from the date by which Israel needs to prove that it doesn't practice discrimination against Americans based on their race, ethnicity, religion, or First Amendment protected activity. If Israel does not, it isn't likely to in the future, particularly given the trend lines in Israel, which are veering ever more in the rightward direction, with cabinet members calling for a new Nakba to dispossess even Palestinians holding Israeli citizenship. So it appears that this trial period is short so that Israel can meet the deadline. There is no explanation for giving Israel only a few weeks to prove that its policies that have been in place for decades no longer exist. There are some other things I want to point out about the MOU quickly that was leaked to the press or online, but which U.S. government has not officially released, as Yusuf mentioned. First, the MOU does not allow for a meaningful assessment of Israel's compliance. The data collected during these few weeks will have to be voluntarily given to the US by Israel and only consists of information on the number of denials and approvals at Israeli-controlled points of entry and the citizenships of the persons. No data must be collected on the race, nationality, religion, age, sex of the travelers at all. And that kind of information is very important to determine whether or not these people are being denied entry for illegitimate reasons. In addition, the trial period envisioned in the MOU doesn't offer any yardstick for determining whether Israel's rate of entry denials or the complaints against it rise to the level of denying them into the visa waiver program. In fact, the MOU says nothing about what happens if Israel doesn't meet the reciprocity requirement during the trial period. The only time the MOU even mentions reviewing Israel for its compliance with the visa waiver program's terms is 6 months after Israel is admitted into the program. Now, if the trial period doesn't have consequences, its only purpose to me appears to be to act as an on-ramp for Israel's admission into the program, whether it qualifies or not. And I'll just stop there.
Thank you very much for those detailed remarks. We're going to turn now to Adam Shapiro.
Thanks, Yusuf. And thanks for the Arab Center and yourself for hosting this really important and timely discussion. And thanks to my fellow panelists for this really important moment. I was reflecting a little bit personally, and I think it's this kind of bizarre moment here where I am one of the panelists who are banned from actually entering Israel or Palestine at this time. I think all my other panelists can actually get in. And so in some ways, they're affected by this program more than me, even though I'm the one who actually experiences the ban. So just the bizarre world that we live in. But I also want to acknowledge that I feel like after listening to Zaha that we're sharing the same brain after working on this so closely for so long. So I might touch on some of the points that she raised, but I think with respect to the MOU and the problems that this is presenting and how that might affect the visa waiver program and the things that we're seeing, we have to acknowledge, first of all, that the MOU itself that was signed last week is not the visa waiver program, that this is an important, even though a lot of this has been conflated in a lot of ways. And certainly the confusion that's going on right now amongst State Department officials, amongst DHS officials, amongst Israeli officials, websites, people traveling, people planning on traveling. There is a lot of confusion and questions, and it's hard to believe that this is in some ways not by design, that there's at least some element of interest in creating enough confusion that would allow Israel to sort of sneak by and get into the program. The MOU, as Zaha started to identify, proposes a lot of questions and a lot of problems. One of the fundamental problems that it presents as directly affects Palestinian Americans is that it doesn't offer definition for things that require definition. And by that, what I mean is the MOU speaks about what it calls terms residents of the West Bank and residents of Gaza. It also talks about the Palestinian Population Registry. And for non-Arabic speakers, I'm going to mention the word Hawiya. Hawiya is essentially the Palestinian ID that's given to Palestinian people who are on the Palestinian Population Registry, whether or not they actually physically live in the occupied territories of the West Bank and Gaza. And let's leave Jerusalem aside for a second. I'll touch on that in a minute. So in terms of the document, the MOU, it speaks about residency and it speaks about the population registry. What's not clear, though, is does the permissions that are now allegedly being given for people to travel and access the airport and then continue on and visit different spaces, whether or not this is referring to people who are just on the registry or of people who are actually residing in the territories. In some cases, it could be both. In some cases, it might mean one or the other. One of the cases where it might mean one group, the people who are resident, actually living there, and not the people who are coming from the United States, and again, possibly because we don't know, is regarding this app that is run by the civil administration, COGAT by its acronym, which is an app that people have to download onto their devices and register their information. In the past, and Jessica would know this because our organization actually raised legal questions about this when the app was first introduced. This app is used for a number of different services and access that Palestinians living in the West Bank need, not just those who are American citizens, but all Palestinians who are in the West Bank. They need permissions, they need documents, etc. They can do it through the app, and that was set up in light of COVID because a lot of the offices and services were not being done in person. There were privacy questions raised at the time by Hamaked about this app and about what information was being collected and what the terms of service were. It's not clear if the COGAT administration actually ever really cleared those up or made those more or better in terms of digital privacy rights. But what is definitely unclear is whether or not this app needs to be used by American citizens, whether or not they're resident, actually living in the West Bank or not. What happens with the data that is collected? Under whose authority is this data? How long is the data being held? Who is it potentially being shared with? And finally, if this app itself is potentially a delivery system for spyware onto individuals' devices. We know that Israeli companies are very active in the spyware business. We know the Israeli government has deployed various means of surveillance and spyware against Palestinians. And so there were real questions that don't seem to have been asked or answered, not asked by DHS, Department of Homeland Security, or Department of State, and certainly not answered by the Israelis in terms of this app. So these are some significant questions. Now, going back to definitions, the definitions bleed into this question of classes of American citizens. And so what we can immediately identify is that, as Zaha indicated, there's automatically two classes of American citizens. Those who are of Palestinian descent and who are on the Palestinian population registry, whether or not they actually live in the West Bank or Gaza or live outside, and all other American citizens who do not have to show any other ID or be registered with any other ID once they enter beyond entering the airport and accessing the occupied territories. So an American citizen who is not Palestinian with a Palestinian ID can go to an Israeli settlement in the occupied territories, so inside the West Bank, and not have to show any other form of ID, not have to prove in any other way who they are or come under any other kind of security regime or legal regime, as Zaha indicated, with the martial law that people are under in the occupied territories. Palestinians, however, American citizens who are Palestinians do. If they want to go to places like Ramallah or El Bire or anywhere where they want to visit their family or friends or tourism for any reason. So right automatically, there's two different classes. Then there's the different classes of Americans, whether you're a resident of the West Bank or of Gaza. In the document in the MOU that we've seen, which again hasn't been published, it specifies that there is a way for American citizens with a Gaza ID can access Gaza. But then in the annex, it then says, well, actually, you can't, because the crossing point between Israel and Gaza, the Erez crossing, is not a routine travel, checkpoint, or sorry, not checkpoint, but border crossing or travel crossing. Again, it doesn't define what would be routine. It doesn't define how or when that will be evaluated to ensure that that kind of travel can occur. The specifications for US citizens with a Gaza ID, it's also unclear if the regulations only apply to those US citizens with a Gaza ID or to all US citizens in terms of having a first-degree family member to visit, limiting that children who are under 12 can enter with their parents, but those who are over the age of 12 have to come in on their own volition, basically. So they have to be assessed separately from their parents. So you could have a situation where a child who's 13 or 14 years old is denied while the rest of their parents and the other family members are permitted. This seems to be arbitrary. It seems to be a new definition of child by the Israeli government that hasn't been used before. It also should open up questions, and I'm not suggesting anything nefarious at this point, but for a government like the United States government that is extremely concerned about child trafficking, this would actually raise some significant questions that could pertain to that area of work. If now all of a sudden children between the ages of 13 and 18 are no longer considered children for the purpose of this visa regime. So just to flag that there seem to be compromises being made all over the place to accommodate the Israeli discriminatory system. And I'll just mention one other piece, just to show the extent to which we have concerns based on the amount of like exceptions being made for Israel, or unique way Israel's being treated with this visa waiver program. With all other countries that have entered visa waiver program, those countries have had to get their sort of ducks in order before they could enter the visa waiver program. They had to either pass new legislation in their countries, set up new rules and regulations, establish new electronic systems to processing, people coming in and out of the country. All of that had to be done, accomplished, and finished and tested prior to the country entering the visa waiver program. This memorandum of understanding establishes a date of May 1st, 2024, so more than 6 months after the September 30th deadline, whereby what's called the Marom system, and I don't know, Jessica, if you know more about this than we do, but the Marom system seems to be what would be the kind of ESTA system, the registry where people have to register before they would travel to Israel, get the approval within 24, 48 hours, and then that would be their way of participating in the visa waiver program. The MOU notes, though, that the Marom system still has not been approved through legislative means in the Israeli government, and it gives Israel until May 1st, 2024 to do that and to get the system up and running. So not only is this a clear exception that's being made for Israel to just sort of bypass having the systems in place, it also gives them a deadline that is beyond the 6-month period, which according to the visa waiver program statute, the Department of Homeland Security has to review after the first 6 months of a program being in place. It has to review how things are going and make sure that the law is being followed, et cetera. This puts that deadline after that 6-month window, which, as Zaha mentioned, already doesn't evaluate and check all of the kind of things that we have concerns about and that Israel has practiced in using in terms of discrimination. It also gives them a pass for what seems to be a core component from a security standpoint of being able to have a system that actually collects and processes data in an effective way that has to do with the security concerns that the United States has and that Israel, I guess, would have. So these are a number of the things that we see in the visa waiver, in the MOU, that is meant to be the basis for Israel's admittance into the visa waiver program. And that just raises up a whole ton new red flags that should be setting off alarm bells, not just for us in our community, but really for people in the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of State, because this gets to the core of why they're having this program in the first place. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Adam. We'll transition now to Jessica Montel for her opening remarks.
Thanks, and thanks for having me. I want to zoom out a little bit to look at the Palestinian population as a whole, and I'm participating from Jerusalem, and my organization is primarily concerned about Palestinians living under occupation, West Bank, East Jerusalem, and in the Gaza Strip, and that's our entry point to this topic, because you're talking about family members of Palestinians or Palestinian institutions that would want foreigners like Americans to come to universities or schools, volunteer, investors. And we have been tracking over the past 30 years, but intensively over the past 2 years, the way the Israeli military, Kogat, has been exacerbating the restrictions on foreigners coming to the West Bank. First to say Gaza is almost completely inaccessible, even for family members or, but certainly no ability for free travel, and also travel to the West Bank. Over the past year, the new regulations of the Israeli military establish very severe restrictions on who can come to visit the West Bank. So it's not only Palestinian Americans or Arab Americans who are restricted, but any American or European or anyone who wants to visit their college roommate who lives in Ramallah. No, that is not a good enough reason. You don't have any right to access Ramallah. Say if your college roommate lives in Tel Aviv, or in the Ariel settlement, you would be able to visit them freely. So those sorts of visits of everyone have been very severely restricted, but also if you're talking about, again, business opportunities, the freedom of Palestinian academic institutions to have faculty and staff and students coming to those institutions, all of that has been restricted. And then the third category, which is really the largest group of people harmed, are family members of Palestinians. And because Israel controls the Palestinian population registry, Israel decides who can be, let's say, naturalized as a Palestinian. I mean, to get this, the Hawiyah, the Palestinian ID card, the Israeli Defense Ministry is the final arbiter. And then what that means is an American citizen could be married to a Palestinian, own a home in the West Bank, in Ramallah, living there for 20 years, have Palestinian children, working there, bank account, and will never be naturalized as a Palestinian, will always be a foreigner. And then the ability to live in your own home, I mean, to go home to America, to visit, if one of your parents gets sick, you want to go home and visit, and then come back to your home, you're still viewed as a foreigner. So now Israel has come with this, test period, this pilot of the month for US citizens that should be able to travel freely or more freely. As you have heard, there is a lot of lack of clarity. I mean, there are the declarations, the memorandum of understanding that was signed. What has been put on the Israeli government, there's a web page now for Palestinian Americans who want to either go to the West Bank or go to Gaza. And there's what is actually happening on the ground, because this is apparently, already in force. And the situation is unclear. But I would flag, there are a few things that I think are important to state. Number one, it's possible that over the next month, people have easier travel abilities, that actually, Americans can travel to the West Bank via Israel's airport, which they have not been allowed to do. If you want to come from the United States to Ramallah, you would have to fly to Jordan and then cross the land border from the Allenby Bridge to get to Ramallah, although of course it would be much more convenient. Anyone else traveling would go through Ben Gurion, Israel's airport. So over the course of the next month, Israel is saying Palestinian Americans and Palestinians coming to, the West Bank can use the airport. That is it will be easing and making life easier for a lot of families and people who previously couldn't be able. An American married to a Palestinian in the West Bank can now fly home to visit their parents in the United States and come back home without having to worry that maybe they won't be allowed in or will otherwise be restricted. So, there can be good news without that meaning that Israel is abiding by the principles of the reciprocity that is treating all Americans equally. Again, for individual families, it's great that they can take advantage of this coming month. And I think that's a separate conversation than US policy and what it means to be letting Israel into the visa waiver program. I would also add parenthetically, at this precise moment with this government and all that this government is doing, regardless of free movement through the airports, it is an odd time to be giving Israel this huge benefit in the form of the visa waiver program. But it's also important for me to say that the conversation between the United States and Israel, of course, the US has to first and foremost take care of its own nationals and make sure that they are not being discriminated against or in other ways their rights violated. But of course, the US has to be concerned. The US foreign policy is much broader than taking care of its own nationals. And here it's really important to state the Israeli military controls the West Bank and is governed by international humanitarian law, everything that it is doing there. And that also concerns, who's allowed to enter the West Bank, who's allowed to stay in the West Bank. And there are two criteria that are legal for the Israeli military to be operating under. One is Israeli military, security concerns, which have to be understood very specifically, tangibly, not, sort of vague, overarching, but legitimate security needs. And the second concern is the welfare of the local population, the population living under occupation, the Palestinians. So any restrictions on, access to teachers coming to teach in Palestinian universities, or, anyone who wants to come, as a tourist or a pilgrim to the West Bank, limitations on that can only be for, very clearly defined security needs or for the welfare of the Palestinian population. And it's clear that neither of those is the case. The COGAT restrictions on access to the West Bank are obviously not designed for the welfare of the local population. And these blanket restrictions on access, it's not one specific person that is thought to be a security risk, but, whole categories of people that are not allowed to come or stay. Obviously, that's not a legitimate security concern. So that has to be also part of the conversation. It's not enough. Again, I think the visa waiver program is an opportunity to have this broader conversation about Israel's legal obligations, the expectations from the international community, including the United States, for Israel, and how it is administering, basic rights of families to live together, universities to have academic freedom, all of these basic obligations that Israel has to respect. I would hope that that again, it's an opportunity to be broadening the conversation rather than pushing the US into this very narrow focus of only looking at treatment of US citizens. And just one word on Gaza. Access to Gaza is also under Israeli control. The situation, what this memorandum of understanding and the website is unclear. What seems to be the case now, as Adam said, only Americans with first-degree relatives in Gaza will be allowed to visit once a year, not through Ben Gurion Airport. You would have to take a very circuitous route through Jordan and the Allenby crossing to get to Erez and enter into Gaza. So in the best of circumstances, access to Gaza will remain extremely restricted. It's not at all clear that Gazans will benefit from even this pilot period of the visa waiver program.
Thank you very much for all of that, Jessica. Before we turn to Maya now, I just want to offer a quick reminder that you can submit questions for our panelists through Zoom's Q&A feature or via email to events@arabcenterdc.org. We'll move into our questions period after we finish with our introductory comments. And to round those out now, we turn to Maya. Maya Berry, please go ahead.
Thank you, Yusuf, and the Arab Center for hosting us. And thank you to my colleagues, both for the excellent presentation today, but particularly the work that's gone into this issue for an extended period of time by everybody here today. So that has to be acknowledged. I want to just say one thing before the onset of my comments, which is I think it's important to understand how extraordinary it is that we are having this conversation today. And by that, I mean, this panel should not be happening. There are very real issues that have to be addressed in the US-Israeli relationship. There are very real issues that have to be addressed in the context of defending Palestinian human rights and addressing the brutal and ongoing occupation. We can make a litany of lists of what should be discussed and how we should be engaging US policymakers, but yet here we are. And I think this is part of the extraordinary nature of the Israeli exception that often takes place. So I wanted to kind of, the analysis that my colleagues have done, and particularly the legal analysis on this MOU and this work, is really, really important. It's just remarkable that we are having this conversation today. Let's start with that. So to begin with, how did we even get here, right? Part of what's interesting about this issue, and Yusuf and Zaha's remarks, really laid it out correctly in terms of why this program exists, how we admit countries into it. Our relationship to Israel's treatment of Arab Americans, Palestinian Americans, and others who advocate on the issue of Palestinian human rights dates back decades. We have been collecting stories of how Arab Americans have been treated at Israel's borders and port of entry for literally decades. We have petitioned our government and have gone to our government to say, we are US passport holders, and this is how we are facing discrimination. And the cases range from, I was there, I was held for 6-7 hours, I was denied entry, they went through my computer, they took my phone. We have accounts of a young girl, 8 years old, separated from her family, placed in a different room. We have accounts of people who, after being held up as long as that they were, only some members of their families are released, and you're told, go ahead and go, but what do you do with your other family members? People that arrive and that are told you're denied entry, and then they have to, pay for their own flights back. People like Adam, who have been banned permanently. People like members of Congress, because there's an ideological exclusion that gets applied, who cannot provide the level of congressional oversight that is required of US policymaking, particularly given the size of the aid packages that are military aid packages that are administered to Israel, because they were denied entry. So the stories we've collected for many, many years, and we have them. And our government's response has historically been, we understand, and as Zaha has pointed out, our State Department has on its website periodically provided a warning for Arab Americans who were traveling to Israel, the occupied territories, actually stating often, this is the treatment you will receive. It is disparate treatment. It's different. Sorry, folks, here it is. I'm being a little flip. It didn't say sorry, but it did acknowledge this is how you will be treated, right? So those warnings have been issued periodically, have been revised. They exist because there is acknowledgement that this is what Arab Americans face at Israel's border. And when we've asked our government to do a better job of protecting our rights, the simple answer then was, well, a country has the right to control its own borders. Therefore, we can provide the warnings. We don't do the data collection on how many are not allowed in, but we just have to acknowledge Israel controls its own borders as individual countries do. So that didn't get very far, and we then have the warnings that exist. So the difference, because we tried, I must say, we tried to say there is an equal protection issue here. Right? Like, we do not get the same treatment as others. Now, you couldn't make that case because technically, again, a country has a right to defend its borders or to control its borders the way that it does. Now, as we consider admitting Israel into the visa waiver program, our government is choosing to privilege the state of Israel with entry into this program, suggesting, I think, for the first time, a different set of rules with regards to, can we make an equal protection claim here or not? So we'll leave that for the lawyers to kind of figure it out. But I think the key element here is to understand this is coming after 30, 40 years of documentation of disparate treatment of Arab Americans, particularly Palestinian Americans, at the border. And now we're saying we acknowledge that because we've had to issue these warnings previously, but we're still going to consider you here. So if this is happening, and who is impacted by this? Right. The first and foremost, and partly because of my bias, Arab Americans, Palestinian Americans in particular. We've talked about this, their degree of relationship to another Palestinian. There is a very deliberate attempt to restrict the travel of Palestinian Americans. Their treatment is completely different upon arrival. And the fact that it happens within the occupied territories, the fact that it happens within the state of Israel, one ought not to be surprised that it also happens when it comes to the border treatment. The fact that it's happening to American citizens is one, again, where we would sort of stop and say, is this really what we are intending to do here? That happens. The second part is in relation to the point about this national security and protecting the security issues that come up. What we have seen, both from what we've documented over these decades, what happened during the 90s in a post-Oslo period where we talked about investment in Palestine, and we had American business people traveling there in order to try to do the kinds of things we were hoping a peace could bring. The treatment of those individuals as well at the borders was so extreme that some said, I can't possibly engage in this program because of what happens when I arrive. So today, when we talk about the security conversation, it's very clear for Israel. And I say this as someone who last year went for the first time with 2 kids who are US citizens born in the United States. I had never traveled to the region before. It's not about security. It's about your proximity to Arab identity. The questions that are asked of us, the way in which the information is handled, the way we are treated. There is no question that this is baked into its system here. So here we are having the conversation about this. Our own government has warned us about the travel. It's been going on for a very long time. We can't do much because country controlling its own borders, but now we have this wonderful program and we want to admit them into this. Now, Zahab correctly pointed out the urgency here. Like, why are we having this conversation now? There are 2 of the key principles Zahab rated. Historically, Israel could not meet the refusal percentage rate. And as a result, Congress actually stepped in at one point and said, we can adjust that rate. They were talking about changing that in order to have Israel comply. That didn't happen, thankfully. So now with COVID, Zahab pointed out to us, we have this unique set of data that could potentially allow them to get in under the 3% requirement. But yet the other statutory requirement of the visa waiver is the reciprocity. So everything we're talking about today, how does one define reciprocity to allow for what's been happening? Well, one cannot, and it's never been defined that way for the 40 other countries that are part of the program. So what happens instead is that you have this MOU that was released. You have 13 pages that attempt to redefine, like as if reciprocity doesn't have meaning. When you look at Appendix A of that document, an attempt to redefine what it means to do this. And as my colleagues have correctly pointed out, we're speaking about a document, the veracity of which has not been confirmed because our own government has not officially released it. We're talking about statements from the state of Israel, statements from the United States, but the actual document itself, we don't know. But taking it at its value, we have this extraordinary annex, and there's a lot to read from this, but I really just have to one sentence. Israel's regulations state that discrimination, and it goes on, is unacceptable. So like, think about the level of reality that has to be suspended in order for us to take this document or this process as realistically tied to US law versus whatever political conversation has been happening on this issue under the Biden administration since they came to office. Now, I know it started previously. I know there've been attempts previously, but something has definitely taken hold politically that has landed us here. And it's contrary to US law. It's contrary to frankly, the words of the MOU that they've released. And it's certainly in violation of the rights of American citizens. There's no question about that. And I started by saying, I understand we're having a very US-centered conversation here. There are very good reasons to have different pieces, but this conversation really is about American citizen treatment. So that's where we find ourselves. I'd rather do more Q&A, so I want to wrap up. In terms of the process, There is a process for how a country enters the program, right? The Department of Homeland Security examines that country's operations. Does it meet the security requirements the U.S. have in place? It looks at a variety of things. Once DHS clears that process, State Department then makes the official request saying we'd like to admit this country into the visa waiver program. And then you move forward. There are other MOUs that have had to be included. So it's not unusual to necessarily have an MOU attached to admittance into the program, but they've never redefined the key statute of reciprocity in it. So in this process, you have career civil servants who are doing their job, who have been going through this. I want to emphasize this point because we have been engaged, and including my colleagues on this call, in a process with our own government officials to make sure when this conversation started that it was rooted in the statutory requirements and in the experience that's been brought to bear by American citizens on this issue. And repeatedly, we were told correctly, Israel does not meet the requirements of the program. And then we have this visit, and then we have this announcement. Now, Adam correctly pointed out, we didn't admit Israel into the visa waiver program through this MOU. But regrettably, we all have a history of understanding how Israel operates in this space, how US policy operates towards Israel in this space. So this MOU, I think, is a clear indication of a very real problem, which is that there's been a political decision to do this, contrary to US law and contrary to the protection of our own rights as American citizens. So though we have given Israel an exception repeatedly in many, many areas, including, by the way, the provision as we have these conversations with our colleagues in government, and they say there is a snapback measure. If Israel doesn't meet the requirements, we'll snap it back because we snap back the Arms Export Control Act, because we snap, I mean, what law have we, what privilege have we given Israel and then said, we've examined this and regrettably you use that weapon for an offensive purpose, so we're gonna take it back. We don't do that. There's a political process in place. And regrettably, this process now has landed not just on the continued violation of human rights in the occupied territory and within the state of Israel, but also indicating blue is no longer blue, because this is the line we've been told. You respectfully, your passport is your passport, and American is an American. We will not allow this. This is happening at the expense of the rights of us as Americans, and it's, you know, deeply, deeply regrettable. I'll stop there, though I can always say more. Sorry.
Thank you very much for that, Maya. And we're going to turn to our Q&A session now. I have a few questions that I would like to direct to all of you, and then we'll take some audience questions as well. Zaha, I want to start with you. And my question for you is, you noted that even members of Congress have been denied entry. And some American travelers as well have been denied entry on the basis of their political views, including supporting BDS or boycott, divestment, and sanctions, or even for things that they may have posted on social media. What do we know now from either the MOU or the statements of Israel and the United States around this about whether or not this particular practice might change?
Thanks for that question. Okay, so what the MOU says is explicitly no Israeli laws need to change as a part of this MOU. And then it says the illegitimate bases for denial of entry include, national origin or ethnicity. Help me out here, Adam. I'm trying to remember. Religion. I think there was like a few categories. Missing was First Amendment protected activity or, expression. That isn't listed as an illegitimate basis for denial of entry. So if we have on the books right now, under Israel's civil law, immigration laws that say that if you support BDS, that's a ground for exclusion. If you're a security risk, that's a ground for exclusion. Any relevant reason, quote, any relevant consideration, that's the phrase, is a ground for exclusion. So if Israel doesn't have to change its laws and the MOU acknowledges no laws need to be changed, and these are still on the books, then we can expect that this will continue, that this practice of denying people entry because of their political speech, their BDS support, will continue. So I don't think I don't think there's any reason to believe that that's going to change as a part of this.
Thank you, Zaha. Adam, I want to ask you next, and Jessica sort of alluded to this as well. This seems like a reward for Israel now. Not really for doing something good, but for maybe sort of no longer doing something bad and discriminating against some Palestinian Americans. Can you put this into the bigger picture of the U.S.-Israel relationship right now?
Oh, wow. All right. Well, I don't know that it's necessarily a reward for doing something not so bad. It's hard to, it is a little bit hard to understand how the timing of this overlaps with what's been developing on the grounds in real time. And I'm not sure the Biden administration really has its head around what is happening on the ground, how the dynamics are playing out, and where it can actually be effective in leveraging pressure to shift things, or to try to shift things in such a way that they would be more comfortable with, because they're clearly not comfortable with what the Netanyahu government is doing at the moment. I think it's fair to say that, even if we're not seeing like more concrete steps that we'd like to see. So I think there's like a timeline for visa waiver program that we've alluded to in terms of the different deadlines and things like that. It also has to do with the timing of Tom Nides, the ambassador there, who made this a core part of his mission as ambassador, and the fact that his time has been wrapped up at this point. He signed the MOU himself, apparently, on basically the last day that he was ambassador. So I think there's some elements of just overlapping timelines that don't necessarily intersect, but that have lives of their own. I think in terms of the overall relationship, I think the Biden administration, frankly, would prefer not to advance the visa waiver program and give it as a reward for Biden. I think the sort of compromise in their minds that they made with themselves was that they signed the MOU when Herzog was in town, and tried to sort of play it off as if this was business, relations between the United States and Israel, has nothing to do with who's the prime minister. But Netanyahu will, if this goes through, claim success. He will claim this as his own victory and try to portray it in such a way as like, oh, the Americans, they can make noise for domestic purposes or for whatever reason, but the reality is that they're still, accommodating us, and we haven't given anything up really in any way for the Americans. So I think that's kind of where things are. I mean, in terms of Maya's point, this idea of a snapback mechanism is a joke, and this idea that somehow the US would remove Israel from the visa waiver program were to admit it would be politically catastrophic, I think, for any politician who tried to do that in the United States, given the nature of the Israel-US relationship and how it affects domestic US politics and especially elections. And we're coming up to an election season. I think the snapback mechanism, the talk about it, will become a casualty of the visa waiver program, or of the MOU or whatever, just as blue is blue, this other term that had been bandied about, but we haven't heard at all since the MOU was signed. So this term blue is blue has become a casualty of the memorandum of understanding. This principle that had been repeatedly expressed by all kinds of officials, that there's no distinction between US citizens, is out the window. It's been actually signed. Tom Nides agreed to this MOU that would allow for the discrimination of American citizens. So, that I think is the trajectory of anything that is a commitment by the United States that isn't on paper, we can see gets thrown out, the window at earliest possible moment. I just want to come back to something I mentioned earlier during my presentation, just because I just want to be sure we touch on this, because again, it gets to sort of how the United States is just accepting Israeli terms for an American program. And that has to do with Jerusalem. I noted this and didn't come back to it, but basically Palestinians who are residents of Jerusalem, and I'm not talking about American citizens here, though there could be some, but basically Palestinians who are residents of Jerusalem are excluded from this program entirely, even though by being resident of Jerusalem, they have Israeli documentation, both for their local, their residency. They pay taxes, they have services from the Israeli government, etc. They are not under the authority of the Palestinian Authority. and they receive travel documents, or they can receive travel documents from the Israeli government. The visa waiver program stipulates that it is supposed to apply to nationals. And this gets to Zaha's earlier point. She was talking about nationals. The Israeli government doesn't want all the Palestinians in the West Bank to become nationals of Israel. Well, Palestinians in Jerusalem, effectively by the terms of the visa waiver program, really are nationals of Israel, because by the definitions that are in the visa waiver program statute, which have to do with who issues you a travel document, in this case, the government of Israel. And effectively, like where all by all other metrics, they should be considered nationals of Israel. But because not only does the United States not recognize Palestinian as a nationality, so they can't be listed as in the U.S. system as Palestinian, they are listed as Jordanian, because that's the only available option, since Israel doesn't consider them to be Israeli nationals. Israel also doesn't have Palestinian as an option for nationality. It also lists Palestinians who are resident of Jerusalem as either Arab or Jordanian. And so they effectively exclude them they erase them from everything, and therefore aren't allowed to be considered in this program. How this has an effect for the visa waiver program is that it enables Israel to not have to count, it allows the United States to not count any Palestinian from Jerusalem who would apply for a visa to the United States and be rejected. That would go into the visa rejection rate that the United States has, or the calculation of 3% that Israel needs to meet. I don't know the numbers from Jerusalem who apply, but what we do know is that the rejection rate for Palestinians who are citizens of Israel, for Palestinians who are resident of the West Bank, and for Jordanians, the denial rate for all three of those populations is way higher than for Israeli Jews. So the likelihood that there would be an effect of including Palestinians from Jerusalem in the visa denial rate of Israeli nationals, that would cause it to go above 3% is very high. And so therefore the exclusion of this population and the attempt to continue to exclude any other Palestinians from participating in this program remains extremely high. Just one other point I want to that I didn't get to about a risk that this program poses, because I think we should also address this, even if this goes through. Even if in a perfect world, every American citizen with a Palestinian ID is admitted and without discrimination, I think the Jerusalem example, again, is important to note. Palestinians from Jerusalem who have left to go study, to go live abroad for work, for medical emergencies or whatever, have been routinely removed from their residency status in Jerusalem, and therefore lose their ability to go back and live in Jerusalem in the future. So somebody who comes as a student to the United States for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years for college, often find they get removed from the list, the population list by Israel, and therefore lose the right to reside in Jerusalem. It has also happened to Palestinian residents of the West Bank, where they have been removed from the population registry and lose their Hawiyah, their ID document. If Palestinians who have Hawiyah are participating in the visa waiver program, we should anticipate that Israel might come back and say, oh, well, you're a temporary visitor. You're coming on your US passport. You have no interest in residing in this territory, and therefore we're going to remove you from the population registry. This would have consequences for property. This would have consequences for legal status, for marital status, for all kinds of issues. And I think we should be raising the red flag, on this thing as well, given that there are no protections in this MOU for any American citizen, including and especially for Palestinians who have Hawiyah.
Thank you, Adam. And before I turn to Jessica now, I just want to say that while we've been on this webinar, the spokesperson for the State Department was asked in their daily press briefing about whether or not they intend to publish the terms of the MOU, and they said that they have no plans to do so. So that little bit of information is developed while we've been in the midst of this conversation. Jessica, I want to ask you about the lack of clarity. You talked about the lack of clarity in this whole process. Can you talk about how endemic the lack of clarity is in the bigger permit regime that is the occupation, and what sort of burden this places on Palestinians just trying to figure out how to go about their daily lives?
Yes, I mean, great question. Lack of transparency is built in that people, one area of work, let's say that Hamuked deals with, is Palestinians who are banned from leaving the West Bank. But there's no process by which people are alerted to the fact that they have this ban, and what their rights are and how they might go about contesting it. For most people, unless they're aware, they've had the experience before, people show up at the Allenby Bridge crossing to cross over to Jordan, right? They've already bought a flight out of Amman. They've, packed up they get to the crossing and are denied exit from the West Bank because they have a travel ban in place. And Hamuked has submitted a Freedom of Information request to the military. At any given time, over 10,000 Palestinians are banned from leaving the West Bank. But there's no proactive measure to inform them again or explain to them. It's only that Hamuked, through trial and error of hundreds and thousands of cases, has worked out what the procedure is, how you might go about lifting that travel ban. So that's one small example. The issue of free movement of Palestinians from anywhere to anywhere. I mean, of course, travel between the West Bank and Gaza is extremely restricted. West Bank and Gaza Palestinians who want to enter East Jerusalem or enter Israel, even within the West Bank, if you have land on the other side of the separation wall, or family, or any reason that you need to get access even within the West Bank to travel, that you need, again, to navigate a very cumbersome, unclear, completely non-transparent procedure, even to be moving within the West Bank. So, and then when you talk about the COGAT, what is ironic, when we started mobilizing against these new COGAT restrictions, the Israeli military restrictions, which were first published about a year and a half ago. And this is like a 50, 60, 70 page document about who can come, foreigners coming for all different reasons, the short-term visits that are relevant to the visa waiver, and longer-term stays, and spouses, and academic, in very great detail, explaining how they will be restricting access. And in response to all of the criticism that this is outrageous and illegal, all of these restrictions, the response of COGAT was, we are, in fact, it's an improvement because we are being transparent. And it is the case that a lot of those, newly written down procedures were not new, that in fact, they were being implemented all the time without having, anything that people could refer to about what is the actual policy. And that also is true today, that a lot of the elements of the COGAT restrictions on the entry of foreigners, it says that certain things are not allowed, and yet you see that somehow people manage. And I think this is one of the big concerns. I mean, as Zaha said, they are not canceling or amending the COGAT restrictions for the entry of foreigners. There's some carve out, apparently, for American citizens or certain types and circumstances of American citizens. They're going to continue restricting the ability of American citizens to be living with their spouse in the West Bank or teaching in a Palestinian institution. That's out of the visa waiver, because the visa waiver is only, up to 90-day stays. But also what is, I know this is a US focused conversation, but, Europe has a visa waiver program with Israel. Israelis travel freely to Europe. Europeans are supposed to travel freely to Israel. But all of these restrictions, which now are being, maybe lifted for Americans, are in place for Europeans. So, it is a little bit puzzling. Europe is going to sit by, a French national who was born in Morocco is barred from entering the West Bank. Dutch citizen who has a Jordanian passport is not allowed to travel to the West Bank. Of course, a French Palestinian or a German Palestinian, and you have large populations, of these dual nationals. are apparently going to continue to be discriminated against while Israelis continue to enjoy visa-free travel to Europe. I mean, it is, an interesting. It will be interesting to watch whether Europe is going to continue to accept this discrimination if Americans are going to have their own little carve out from this restriction.
Yeah, very important point there. Thank you so much, Jessica. Maya, wanted to ask you, you've talked about previous efforts at engaging the State Department about the many concerns of the community with all of this and entry denials in particular. How receptive have they been to the community? Can you describe what those interactions have been like?
Sure. I think they've certainly been receptive, and I drew the distinction between the career foreign service officers or civil servants of those who work in government and understand the programs that they're running. I have deep respect for staff who do this work. I would share logically that sort of extend it the same way when you talk with congressional staff who understand how this should all be playing out, but yet we have the Israel exception, and the reason I think this was so, I was naive enough to be so shocked by this is that, again, we know these things happen and they play out a certain way, but they don't typically happen to the point of impacting US citizens this way. So our own government sort of compromising the rights of the US citizenship like this was, in my mind, what made this one a bit different than the other Israel exceptions that have played out. And, Yusuf, the point you just made about the State Department spokesperson, we were on a call together, I think a week ago, where the question was raised, are we getting the MOU? And I, again, naive enough to say, of course, we're going to have to get the MOU. I mean, they either has to classify this document for some reason, or we will have a document to be able to review. So I haven't read the transcripts of today's question, but what an extraordinary place to be, which is that you're going to violate our law. You're going to violate our rights and then potentially not also provide us with the mechanism that does this violation so that we can legally challenge it. And the second point I would make, both in terms of the staff and on this issue of whether they release the MOU or not, protected work product is one thing, but this is an existing program. What is happening here with the Israel exception also applies to the other states that are participants in this program. So if you want to create an MOU that redefines reciprocity, doesn't this definition then apply to the other existing members of the visa waiver program? It's only going to apply to Israel because this existing MOU is only between our two countries. There's a lot of legitimate questions that come up in this regard. And the final point I would make about it is whether it's the staff at the State Department or the staff at the Department of Homeland Security or the members of Congress who are required to provide the congressional oversight of these laws, they have to see this MOU. So maybe it takes a little longer to get to me and you, but like for Congress to do its job, they have to understand, are we meeting the law and the public transparency requirements built into this? Are, if they're going to be defied, then I think it's really quite telling as to why we said this at one of our meetings. One member we were talking to, the US government, said we've never had negotiations like this. And my answer was, that's the tell. This is how you know they don't belong here. This should not be happening. And I think that's continuing to play out here when you have a State Department official having to say, no, we're not going to release what should be a very benign document that's facilitating a relationship in an important program.
Yeah, thank you for that, Maya. I want to turn now to audience questions, and we do have a number of them. I'm going to try to group a couple of these by theme because there are several that are sort of similar. And as you might imagine, we've received a number of questions for folks who want to understand what this means for them personally. We've got a couple different questions coming in about their own particular situations. One person says, I'm a U.S. citizen who holds a Gaza ID. Can I visit Israel? Can I transit to Gaza? We have another question like that from a Gaza ID holder as well, who wants to understand what this means for them. Can I go home and visit my family? And also for a Palestinian who has a expired an expired Palestinian passport, how will they be treated? So maybe we can start with those. Maybe Zaha or Adam, you can give us your take on answers to these questions, and then we can move on to a couple more.
Yeah, thanks. I'll jump in and then Adam can cover what I leave out. He's good at doing that for me. You know, the questions that people are having just really highlight how important it is to have sort of the public MOU people can look at and read. How important it is to have public discussions, town halls, where people can relay their experiences to U.S. officials. We've done some of these discussions privately. Maya and I have, Adam as well. But you know, there needs to be a public discussion about this because you know, I'm currently getting all these messages from email and text from people asking me, what do I do? The MOU that is online says one thing, but when I look at the Israeli website, it says something else. Or when I look at the US Embassy website, it says something completely different. So I don't have good answers for you, but I can tell you what the MOU says about somebody who's got a Gaza ID, who's coming from the US. That person who's a US citizen should be able to fly into Ben Gurion. But if they want to travel in transit to Gaza, unless they have applied 45 days in advance for a military permit that would allow them, and they have a first degree family member, and you know, they are of a certain age, you know, they will be denied. If you ask consular officials this question, and I've gotten screenshots of emails from people who've asked consular officials in the US Embassy whether they can do this. They say no, Gaza is not part of this visa waiver program trial, people with Gaza ID. So I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. But again, that just tells you we need clarity here. And unless you create a system where all Americans are treated differently, you're going to continue to have these kinds of problems. So I'm sorry that I can't definitively answer any question anybody has about whether or not they can enter, because the truth is nobody knows. You know, nobody knows until you show up at the airport and you see what happens to you. Or you show up at the Gaza, you know, crossing and you've got your special permit. Even then you don't know if you're going to get in. I mean, everything is so random and so confusing. And I just want to say one thing about the snapback, this quote unquote snapback provision. There is no snapback. I've read the MOU, and what it says is that maybe if Israel, after a review in 6 months or 18 months or how many times they review Israel, if they see that it's not in compliance with criteria and a yardstick that we don't know, but if they find out that Israel's not in compliance, then maybe they can get out of the program, or maybe there'll be some lesser remedy for Israel. So it doesn't even require that Israel be taken out of the program. So, and that's different. That's different than other countries. Other countries that don't comply with the reciprocity requirement would not be in the program to begin with, and they definitely would be out of the program if they did that after they were admitted. So I just wanted to highlight that. And I also wanted to highlight what bad policy this is. I think you touched on this, Maya, but think about this. As a Palestinian, I'm Palestinian. You know, if I travel to anywhere else in the world with my US citizenship, we have told the world that a Palestinian US citizen is not as good as a real US citizen, somebody who is not Palestinian, you know, or Muslim or Arab. You know, we're encouraging other states then to adopt similar policies for their nationals that are disfavored. And this is really bad. It's bad for us as Americans to be doing this to our own people. And today it's Palestinians, tomorrow it'll be some other disfavored group in the United States. And we can't allow that. You know, it's just not good policy.
Thank you for that, Zaha. There are a couple other questions about the so-called snapback provisions in this agreement that we may or may not ever see publicly put forward by the State Department or anyone else. And that's okay. We know what the politics are around these issues and around the U.S.-Israel relationship. It's highly unlikely, as you know, Zaha, that there would be a way that Israel gets kicked out of this program if it's not in compliance. Just as we've seen with so many things, once they're sort of given, it's much harder to take them back. So, what sort of legal recourse, if any, could American citizens have in such a situation where Israel becomes part of this program, but is not fulfilling the requirements? And that's directed to anyone who thinks they have an answer to that question.
I can just take a quick stab at it. Just let me first, just to follow up what Zaha was talking about earlier. I wholly agree with what she said. I would just urge anybody in the audience who is going to try and go, that if you do experience any kind of difficulties, there is a new form that the U.S. government is setting up, that has set up with the embassy. And I'm sorry I don't have the link to post, but if the Arab Center could maybe do that. It's important to report these things. We don't, as I have mentioned, there's lots of problems with this mechanism to monitor and evaluate. But if they don't get the information, then they'll just come back after 30 days and say, well, we didn't receive any complaints, or we don't know any experiences where people were denied. So we do need that information to be presented, even as bad as we think the system is, or how much we've been asking for a system like this for a very long time, and it just hasn't materialized until last week. So that's first. In terms of legal provisions, where there is a procedure under the Administrative Procedures Act of the US government that regulates how rules and laws are implemented, and if they're implemented in such a way that violates that law, and clearly, discriminating against American citizens is not something that should be that's permitted by US law, there would be a way to challenge that legally, and that's something that a number of organizations are already working on, and we're looking at the options for that, whether that could be done at this point when we only have the MOU and we don't actually have this program formally adopted yet, or if it has to wait until Israel is admitted into the visa waiver program. These are questions that people who have much more experience with the law, and particularly with the Administrative Procedures Act, would have to look at. Beyond that, though, an individual American citizen who, let's say somebody who has a Gaza ID and then is effectively excluded from this program or is denied entry, even though they're supposed to be allowed on the basis of them having a Gaza ID. Unfortunately, there don't seem to be a lot of legal maneuvers that they can take, and this is part of the problem with putting a country into the program, is that there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of ability to, from the U.S. citizen side, to address the problems that might exist in the program. There's actually a number of provisions that would be available for the Secretary of Homeland Security or the Secretary of State to remove Israel from the program, that have to do with what's going on in Israel. And this actually connects to something that Jessica was sort of touching on earlier, and which is made relevant, even more relevant, by an article today in Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper, which explains that just in the last couple of days, there's been a huge surge in interest by Israelis who are seeking foreign passports in order to be able to leave. And while we can save, speculation or commentary about that, one of the provisions that would allow, the United States to remove Israel from the visa waiver program, or not admit it in the first place, has to do with sort of emergencies, coups d'etats, and economic, serious economic situations, which are starting to happen for Israel. And so even at this moment, when all this is going on and all this context is going on, there should be a question that the United States is asking, separate from its concerns, our concerns around Palestinians and Palestinian Americans, is, are Israelis now more likely, and increasingly going to be more likely, to overstay their visas in the United States if they come in under the visa waiver program, given what many are describing as a coup, as a judicial coup, what many are forecasting, including Moody's and others, of a deteriorating economic situation in Israel that could lead to more and more people leaving the country, which we've seen actually happen in the past. And obviously the rise of an authoritarian type regime whereby people who don't feel comfortable living there and who have the options, people like professionals, like doctors and others, who would leave the country voluntarily at this point because they find it, themselves unable to live there. Never mind the steps that the government is taking with legislation towards the LGBT community potentially, the civil society sector, where laws about foreign financing for NGOs has become an issue. There's lots of reasons to look at Israel today and see potentially processes that we've seen in other countries where people have left en masse, like a Russia, like a Hong Kong, and other places. And this raises a big question. Effectively, by entering the visa waiver program right now, the United States would be giving Israelis a pass to come here and effectively not go back, which is the purpose of the visa waiver program in the first place. So there's another risk level, which has nothing to do with Palestinians at this point, but that gets to the heart of the visa waiver program, which makes it even more absurd that now is when it's being considered for entry.
Thank you for that, Adam. And I just wanted to note for attendees on the call that the link to the incident reporting form for the U.S. Embassy, for those who are interested in seeing it, has been dropped into the chat. Just one final question here to round us out, and I'll direct this one to Jessica, since you had raised it. Are you aware of efforts by European governments to call out the discriminatory treatment of their citizens, if they're Palestinian dual nationals, for example, and what those kind of efforts have been like with the Israeli government in the past?
So over the course of the past year, with this new COGAT regulation, European governments have been following very closely, and following very closely is clear. What they have been doing in terms of, diplomatic engagement is less clear. And both the US and Europe, a little bit are holding back until they have the actual cases of their nationals being discriminated against. Again, because there is a gap between the official policies and what's happening on the ground, and as Zaha said, it's a little bit random, how people are treated, and also how the communication between individuals who may be stopped at border crossings, whether they are reporting those cases to their consulates and embassies. So the big picture, Europe has been concerned over the past year. I have not heard any statements from European capitals about this carve out for Americans, that US citizens are going to benefit, whereas Europeans remain discriminated against. So that would be interesting to follow. And I want to add one more in terms of legal redress, because US citizens also would have redress in Israeli courts if they are denied entry, not as a discrimination or lack of implementation of the visa waiver, but just that their rights are being violated, particularly if they are family members of Palestinians, the rights of Palestinians to have family members come visit them. As Zaha said, we can't give legal, the devil is in the details, that even all of the questions that people have posed, there are so many factors that would affect each person's ability to travel, but people who are denied entry could also have access to Israeli courts to challenge that.
Thank you very much for that, Jessica, and thank you very much to everyone for joining us today and engaging with our speakers. Thank you so much to our panel for being so generous with your time and with your insights and really breaking down this really complex issue that is very much in the news today and providing all of this timely information. Apologies to anyone whose question we did not get to in time. Please do continue to follow the center's work at arabcenterdc.org. Thank you all. Have a great afternoon.